Welcome to the most complex part of the nervous system. It is the control room of most of activities of the body. The other control system is the hormonal system, which is slower than the brain. Now, the brain contains different lobes, fissures, and different features, and what we would like to stress on is association areas. Here is the primary visual area 17 in the occipital lobe, the posterior lobe, and this needs visual association area. When we see something, we must understand what is this. And then there is the primary auditory area, which is area 42, and this is not enough alone because we need an auditory association area, which is area 22, and we need to understand and recognize what is the meaning. And then there is a common integrative area, which is also very important because we need to understand. We don't need only receiving images, receiving sounds, and receiving different sensations. We need association and integration. And there are areas in the brain who are concerned with these functions, and we have to use them. If we collect sounds and words and lectures, and we see images, and we see lots of things, films, mind maps, and we collect this information, and that's it. Then just an example of real life, when a student comes and says, I have lots of information, but my mark is not worthwhile. It is because these lots of information are disorganized, they are not integrated, they are not associated. And this is what happens with a good number of students. When information of different types are integrated and associated, things are very organized, and surely the mark is going to be worthwhile. Therefore, we as scientists are collecting science to build our knowledge. The most important step is integration. And this is the worthwhile quotation we must do, and that is we collect, and then most importantly we integrate. The question is, what is the shape of the surface of the brain? The outer surface of the brain is called the cerebral cortex. And is it smooth? The answer is no. There are elevations and depressions. A depression is called a sulcus, and the plural is sulci. And an elevation is called a gyrus, and the plural is gyri. Now, when you look to your right, you can see that there's a depression in this drawing, and this is a sulcus and an elevation, and this is a gyrus. What is this? This is a very nice histological real section of the cerebral cortex, where you can see at the tip of this pointer that there is a small depression, this is a sulcus, and then at the tip of this pointer you can see that this sulcus is deeper, and it, in its deep part, it even branches. At the tip of this pointer here you can see that this part is facing the surface, so this is a gyrus. Let us do the same information again so that we can really get grasp of it, and we add few things. This is a gyrus, the blue colored part, because it is an elevation, and this is a sulcus because it is a depression, and here is a fissure which is much deeper, sulcus, and we can see that the cerebral cortex is made of gray matter on the outside and white matter on the inside. Why it's gray? It's because it's a collection of cell bodies of neuron. And why is the white matter white? Because it contains axons that are myelinated. Now in the left image, the gray matter has been artificially colored orange, and you can see here is a sulcus, and the outer layer is gray, but it is artificially colored orange, and the inside of the brain or the cerebral hemisphere, it is white, and we know now why it is white. In the figure of your right, you can see that it is the white matter now that has been colored orange. What is this image telling me? It is telling me that this is the superior view of the brain, and I can see that there is a very deep groove dividing the upper part of the brain into two halves. Now this sulcus is so deep that it divides the cerebral cortex into two halves, and when you want to call it a sulcus, it doesn't fit because it is much deeper than a sulcus, and therefore this is called a fissure. What kind of a fissure is this? This is the sagittal fissure of the brain, and what does it do? It divides the brain into two cerebral hemispheres. Here is another view, and we can see that this sagittal fissure of the brain divides the brain into two cerebral hemispheres. This is a coronal section of the brain, and if we look at the orange marked structure, we can see that it is a very deep depression. It is the sagittal fissure of the brain, and it stops at a white structure which is called the corpus callosum, This is a structure that connects the two hemispheres together, back and forth, from right to left and left to right. What is this view showing me? It is showing that the skull, the lateral part of the skull has been removed, and we cannot see the cerebral hemisphere because it is covered with protective membranes. These protective membranes are called meninges, and they are 3 in number. And here we can see the outer one, which is called the Dura Mater, and we can see that in the Dura Mater there are blood vessels traveling in this structure for blood supply. When two of the meninges, the two outer ones, the Dura Mater and the Arachnoid, are removed, we can see the side view of the cerebral hemisphere, and we can see sulci and gyri, and the blue marked structure is a sulcus, and it is called the central sulcus. This is the same view as before, and now the blue marked structure is the lateral sulcus. These sulci, they separate the different lobes of the brain, and we will be coming to that in a few slides. This is not a lateral view of the brain, this is a sagittal view of the brain. And you know what is sagittal? It's dividing the brain into two halves, right and left. And the blue marked structure here is what is called parieto-occipital sulcus. Why we see it in the sagittal view? Because it is most prominent in this view, and in the lateral view it is only running for a short distance. Let's review the sulci and the lobes of the brain in this diagram. The central sulcus is well recognized sulcus as it goes down from the superior border, and it separates the frontal bone, the frontal lobe covered by the frontal bone, from the parietal lobe, which is covered by the parietal bone. And then we have the lateral sulcus, or the lateral fissure, and this separates the temporal lobe, which is covered by the temporal bone, from the frontal lobe of the brain, and it separates it from the parietal lobe as well. Then we have the parieto-occipital sulcus. Sometimes it is called calcarine sulcus, and we can see it only lower down as it is labeled as pre-occipital notch, and it separates the occipital lobe from the parietal lobe superiorly and the temporal lobe inferiorly. Let's have a second look at the lobes of the brain, and the orange marked lobe is the frontal lobe, and it is anterior to the central sulcus, and this is containing motor areas, as we will see in a few slides. Now, the orange marked lobe of the brain is the parietal lobe, covered by the parietal bone, and it is posterior to the central sulcus that separates it from the frontal lobe. I'm sure now you know what is the orange marked lobe of the brain, and as you can see, it is superior to the external auditory meatus and the zygomatic arch. Therefore, this lobe is covered by the temporal bone, and therefore this is called the temporal lobe of the brain. Now it's easy to name this lobe because it is covered by the occipital bone, and therefore this is the occipital lobe. It is at the posterior pole of the brain. Now we have seen 4 lobes. We have seen the frontal, the parietal, the occipital, and the temporal. Now the question is, are these all the lobes of the brain? The answer is no. There is a 5th one which we cannot see on the surface, but we separate the lateral sulcus. We can see that there is sulci and gyri between these 2 lobes, the parietal and the temporal, and this lobe is called the insula. So the brain has 5 lobes, 4 visible and 1 is hidden. Which section of the brain is this? This is a coronal, and you can see that here is the lateral sulcus, and if you go deep to it, you see the blue marked area, which is the insula lobe. Now, you know this orange marked, it is the occipital lobe at the posterior pole of the brain, and we have noticed that the frontal, the temporal, the parietal, and the occipital lobes, plus the insula, are occupying the anterior and middle cranial fossae. And you know that the cranial part of the skull has 3 fossae, an anterior, a middle, and a posterior. Now, the brain is not occupying any part of the posterior fossa, but instead, inferior to the occipital lobe, you can see a whitish structure. This is 2 folds of Dura Mater called falx cerebelli, because inferior to this double layer of dura is the cerebellum. The cerebellum occupies which part of the skull? It occupies the posterior cranial fossa. Let us use this figure to demonstrate the different lobes of the brain in a side view. Here is the central sulcus. If you go to the tip of the line, this is the central sulcus, and anterior to it is the frontal lobe, and posterior to the central sulcus is the parietal lobe, and in the frontal lobe anterior to the central sulcus you find the motor area, and posterior to it is called the post-central gyrus, which is the sensory part of the nervous system. And then we have the temporal lobe, which is inferior to the lateral sulcus, and the occipital lobe is at the posterior pole of the brain. And in this lateral view we also see the cerebellum. cerebellum is inferior to the occipital lobe, and we can see part of the brain stem. The brain is like a tree. It has branches and leaves, and these are the two cerebral hemispheres, but the brain stem is like the trunk of the tree that holds the two cerebral hemispheres. And the brain stem is made of three parts. Here we can see the pons and the lower part, which is called the Medulla Oblongata. Now you know what is this blue colored structure. It is the central sulcus, and the part in front of the central sulcus is called the pre-central gyrus. This is the primary motor area, and then posterior to the central sulcus we have post-central gyrus, and this is a sensory part of the cerebral cortex. This is a superior view of the brain, and the blue mark structure is the central sulcus. The lobe in front of the central sulcus is the blue marked part of the brain here, and of course this is going to be the frontal lobe. The lobe posterior to the central sulcus is going to be the parietal lobe, and this is the post-central gyrus, and this is called the sensory area. What is this view? This is a cross-section of the brain, where we can see that the blue area, of course, is going to be the frontal lobe. The blue marked area of the brain here is at the posterior pole of the brain, and this is the occipital lobe of the brain. Here is a very important structure in this cross section, and that is the blue marked area. The blue marked area, as you can see, it is in the middle of gray matter inside the white matter, and these are two masses called basal nuclei. Some people call them basal ganglia. This blue area has two limbs, an upper one and a lower one, and in this blue structure, which is called the internal capsule, all fibers coming from the body going up to the cerebral cortex, they pass through this narrow, underline narrow space, and they go up to reach the cerebral cortex. At the same time, motor fibers coming down from the cerebral hemispheres or from the brain, going down as motor to muscles and other structures, they also pass through this narrow space called internal capsule. So when all fibers, sensory and motor, they are collected in one narrow space, this is something not favorable, because if there's any lesion in this area, any disease in this area, it is going to have bad effect on the body. And these arrows are indicating that things or actions, they go up and down in this area, and it is lateral to the thalamus. The thalamus is a mass inside the white matter of the cerebral hemisphere. In this figure, we see the body representation in the brain, and it's called the homoniculus. Now, each part of the body has specific area in the brain, whether it is sensory or motor. And for example, if you go to the right, which is the primary somatosensory area, what do you see? You see that the abdomen is in the bottom, and then the tongue, then the teeth, then the face, then the fingers, and then the rest of the body. And on the other side, it is very much similar. Test your information about what is this orange colored structure is, and try to comment on the different parts of this coronal section, and it is always useful to test your knowledge. I will leave the comments on this slide for you to identify the orange marked structure. What I would like you to do is a simple analysis. You can see that superiorly is which part, is it anterior or posterior? So decide what is anterior and what is posterior. The anterior will tell you which lobe, posterior which tell you which lobe is posterior, and then you come to the conclusion, what is this lobe? We had a short idea about the two cerebral hemispheres, the lobes, sulci, gyri, and the different structures there. Now we come to the brain stem. The brain stem is made of three parts: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. This blue structure is the pons, whereas the midbrain, which is higher up, it is hidden, and we are going to see it in a few slides later. This is an inferior view of the brain, and we know now that this central part of the brainstem is the pons, and the blue marked structures are the temporal lobes. The blue marked structure here is the medulla oblongata, the third and the lowest part of the brain stem, and you can see that the medulla is inferior to the pons, and it is superior to the spinal cord. In fact, the spinal cord is a continuation of the medulla going down, and we can see that the cerebellum, two hemispheres are on both sides of the medulla. And if you look at the periphery of the medulla, you can see lots of nerves coming out, because the medulla contains lots of nuclei of cranial nerves. We had a look at a superior view of the brain. We have looked at the lateral view, and then the inferior view. Now we need to look into a sagittal view of the brain, and this is what we see. Here is the medial side of the cerebral hemisphere, and underneath it we see this C-shaped structure, white in color. This is called the Corpus Callosum, and it is made of a bunch of fibers connecting the right and the left hemispheres. The corresponding area of the right with the corresponding area of the left. Then we start to see this this green structure, which is the thalamus. The thalamus is a very important structure because all sensations from all the body, they come and end up in the thalamus, and the thalamus is the gate that will send these sensations to the cerebral cortex. Then the anterior part of the thalamus is called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is a group of nuclei in front of the thalamus, and they are concerned with control of the hormonal system of the body. Then posteriorly we have the epithalamus. We are not going to talk about the epithalamus, except that it has the most posterior part, which is called the pineal gland, which is concerned with the biological clock of the body. Then we come to the brain stem. You see, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus are not part of the brain stem. They separate, or they connect the cerebral hemispheres to the brain stem. They have a name which I am not interested in introducing you to difficult names. This area of thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus is called diencephalon, but we are not interested in these difficult terms. The first part of the brain stem is the midbrain, and it is a small and constricted area which has a central canal in it, which is called the aqueduct. The part of the ventricular system. You see, the brain is not a solid organ. It contains spaces that contain fluid. The next part, or lower part of the brain stem, is the pons. Now, the pons is a matter of fact a station that connects the cerebrum with the cerebellum, and fibers going up to the brain or down to the body, they pass through this structure, the pons. Then we have the third part and the lowest part of the brain stem, which is called the Medulla Oblongata. This Medulla Oblongata is the structure between the pons and the spinal cord, and we will be talking about this later on. And these are the three parts of the brain stem. It is midbrain, pons, and medulla. Then posterior to the brain stem, under the occipital lobe of the brain, is the cerebellum. We will have another run at the structures we see in the sagittal section of the brain. This orange marked area, of course, is the cerebral cortex with its sulci and gyri. Then this orange structure is the corpus callosum. What is corpus callosum? It is a bundle of fibers, white matter connecting the two hemispheres. And this is also the corpus callosum marked blue, and it is a closer look at the corpus callosum. Now, the figure on your left is a sagittal view showing the corpus callosum, and the figure to your right, the orange marked structure, is the corpus callosum. It is at the bottom of the sagittal fissure, and you can see the line has two arrows. It is interconnecting the two hemispheres. Then the blue marked area inferior to the corpus callosum is the thalamus, and we know now some basic information about the thalamus. Now the area in front of the thalamus, the orange marked area, is the hypothalamus, and this is this part controlling the hormonal system, and it has the maestro of controlling the hormonal system, which is the pituitary gland. And then you see this constricted part of the brain stem, which is the upper part, and this is called the midbrain, and we can see there's a line running in the middle of it. This is an aqueduct that connects the ventricular system, and we will be addressing that shortly. Now, what is this blue marked structure? This is the fourth ventricle, because the brain has two lateral ventricles, one in each hemisphere. These are two. Then we have a third ventricle between the thalamus of the right and the thalamus on the left, and then we have the fourth ventricle. This is the fourth ventricle, and you can see that it is posterior to the pons and anterior to the cerebellum. In this sagittal view of the brain, the blue marked structure is the medulla oblongata, which is inferior to, this is another view of the medulla oblongata. It is inferior to the pons and the superior part of the spinal cord, and it connects the spinal cord to the brain, and it is posterior to the. In this view, an anterior view of the brain stem, we can see that this blue part is the pons, and inferior to the pons you see the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata in its upper part has a few swellings and fissures between these swellings. The middle one is called the pyramids, and these two pyramids, one on the right and one on the left, they contain what is called the pyramidal system, the motor fibers that come from the brain passing into the internal capsule, and they come down and they go down the spinal cord to supply muscles. Then lateral to the pyramid we have the olive nucleus. We are not going into details of these nuclei. These are the ventricles of the brain. This is the lateral ventricle in the cerebral hemisphere. This is called the anterior horn, and this is the posterior pole of the brain, and it is called the posterior horn. Then we have two of them, one on the right, one on the left. These are two lateral ventricles. The cerebral hemisphere is not a solid organ. It contains these cavities, and they are filled with fluid called cerebrospinal fluid, CSF in abbreviation. Then there is a little duct that connects the two lateral ventricles with a ventricle called the third ventricle between the two thalami, one on the right, one on the left, and this is the third ventricle. And then there is this duct, which is called the cerebral aqueduct, that connects the third ventricle with the fourth ventricle. And we have seen the fourth ventricle a few slides ago, that is anterior to the cerebellum, as you can see here, and posterior to the pons. And then the fourth ventricle, which is triangular in section, is going to go down the spinal cord. Now, the story is like this. Cerebrospinal fluid from the lateral ventricle goes through the interventricular foramen to reach the third ventricle, and then from the third ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct to the fourth. And look what is going to happen now. The cerebrospinal fluid is going down the spinal cord in the central canal, and at the same time it is connected to the space around the brain in a space called subarachnoid space, and therefore the brain contains ventricles that have fluid, and it is covered by fluid as well. It is the same fluid, and the two parts of the cerebrospinal fluid, the part inside the brain spinal cord, is connected to the part surrounding the nervous system. This is a good exercise for you to recognize what is the green structure and the different parts of the ventricular system of the brain. Here is the story of cerebrospinal fluid. From where is it produced? It is produced by special capillaries in the roofs of the ventricles. So here is a lateral ventricle, and it has special capillaries called choroid plexus. And here is another group in the roof of the third ventricle, and then we have another group in the fourth ventricle. So capillaries come in, they secrete this fluid, and there is a barrier between blood and the cerebrospinal fluid called blood-brain barrier. This is produced by the arms of astrocytes. Then look what is going to happen in the fourth ventricle. The fluid is continuously produced, and it circulates inside the cerebral hemisphere and brainstem. Then it comes to the fourth ventricle, and the fourth ventricle has connections to the space around the central nervous system. There are three foramina that allows the cerebrospinal fluid to leave the intra-central nervous system cerebrospinal fluid and feed the cerebrospinal fluid surrounding the nervous system. Two lateral openings and one central opening. So there are three openings. They have strange names. We are not interested in these names at this stage. The surface of the brain has different areas, and we have seen an image where they are numbered. And now we have to stress this subject because it is very important. Now, this is something we know. It is pre-central sulcus, and this is pre-central gyrus, and this is the primary motor area. And then this is the post-central gyrus, and this is the main sensory area. Then we have this area, the orange one, which is in the frontal lobe, and this is called Broca's area. This is where what is called the motor area of speech. When I decide to say a word, the word is being established in this area, Broca's area. It is translated into movements of different structures like the tongue, the larynx, and so on. This is called Broca's area. It is the area of production of speech. Then, just underneath it, in the temporal lobe, superior gyrus of the temporal lobe. You know, the temporal lobe has three horizontal gyri. This part here, it is the auditory association area. We hear things, we hear words, we hear speech, and here we associate them, we integrate them. Then we have the auditory cortex. This is the recording system of the speech. Then we have an area here which is extending from the temporal into the parietal, and this is called Wernicke's area. This is the area which integrates words and sounds. So here is the area when I present a lecture to you. Here is where you understand it. Use it, please. Then the visual cortex. This is where the image from the eye travels through nerves and comes and being printed here. Then printing an image is not enough. We need understanding the image. So this is the area which is number 17, is called visual association area, and this is where we understand images. I will be leaving this slide with the same principle of functional areas of the lateral side of the cerebral cortex, and please follow the animations and try to get knowledge out of it. It's a good exercise. If we look at the post-central gyrus, and we can see that here we feel our feet, then the trunk, shoulder, elbow, wrist, hand, fingers. Area for the fingers is large one, the face and the lips, and then the tongue. Blood supply to the brain has very special arrangement, because the brain is very sensitive tissue to oxygen, and if oxygen is cut for 6 to 8 minutes, the brain is dead. And this special arrangement is called the circle of Willis. It is a circle. It's being fed by 4 arteries. If one of the arteries is blocked, then the 3 arteries will still feed the circle of Willis. And the story starts. Here is a vertebral artery, and here is a second, and the 2 vertebral arteries unite together to form the basilar artery, giving branches to the bones and cerebellum and so on. And then this basilar artery is going to give the posterior cerebral artery going to the posterior part of the brain. This is the vertebral or the basilar part of the circle. The second part is the part coming from the internal carotid artery, and it is going to share in the formation of circle of Willis, and it is going to give the anterior cerebral artery and a communicating artery and a posterior communicating artery. By the internal capsule. This is a very important piece of information concerning the blood supply of the internal capsule. In this slide, we're going to see animations describing the different parts of the brainstem and the cerebellum. It is a good exercise that you practice your skills in understanding this image, and everything is well animated, as this one as well, which stresses on the internal capsule. And you know now basic information about the internal capsule. And this is a group of gray matter inside the white matter, and these are called the basal nuclei, or sometimes called basal ganglia. What do? They coordinate movements. They make them fine, they make them nice, and without them movements are going to be distorted. We are not going into details of the basal nuclei. Now, we also need to write down notes after we see images, and you can go through these very easily and very important. The same as this image, where you can see the thalamus, the crus cerebri, or the cerebral peduncles, which is the continuation of the internal capsule as it goes in the brainstem. It is going to disappear behind or pass through the bones and then into the medulla and then into the spinal cord. Now, these are two parts of the brain stem, the bones and the medulla. Where is the midbrain? The midbrain is posterior, and you can see it here, that has four swellings called colliculi, two superior colliculi and two inferior colliculi. And in the medulla, we have, and most anteriorly, the pyramids. We have seen that, and the olive nucleus as well. But as you go lateral, you see two nuclei, which are the nucleus cuneatus and nucleus gracilis. These are concerned with upper limb and lower limbs. Now, what covers and protects the brain? The answer is three meninges: outer, middle, and inner. Now, under the scalp, you can see the Dura Mater. The Dura Mater is made of two layers. The outer one is periosteal part of the Dura Mater, and the inner one is the meningeal part of the Dura Mater. Now, these are stuck together, but they form different structures. We are not going to mention them at this stage. Then there's a space between the periosteal layer and the bone. This is called extradural space. This is a problem when somebody receives a hit on the head. Blood may collect in this area and press on the brain. And there is another space deep to the dura, which is called subdural space. This is also a potential space for collecting blood. But the two layers are stuck together in most places. Then we have the arachnoid matter. The arachnoid is thin, transparent membrane, and it has spikes that is going to go down into the space just underneath the arachnoid, which is called the subarachnoid space. In this space, you find the cerebrospinal fluid. And subarachnoid space is a very important space because if there is hemorrhage in this space, it is going to be very dangerous. Then the innermost, that's the subarachnoid space. The innermost layer, which is a fibrous layer attached firmly to the surface of the cerebral cortex, this is called pia mater. Practice your skills and your understanding and test yourself in looking at this image and identifying the different parts of the meninges. It's important that after we have seen the meninges and we had very basic knowledge about them, we must write notes. And I'm going to leave these few slides for you to read, because I don't think you need me to read them for you. And these are very basic facts about the meninges surrounding the brain. That's about the arachnoid. and that's it.